Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the MedTech Impact Podcast, where you get to hear from leaders and innovators who are shaping the future of medical technology. I'm Kyle Cruz.
And I'm Richard Michalski.
And we're your hosts of the show.
Thanks, Kyle. So today we have two of Forge's finest, David Thompson, Senior Program Manager, and Mark Michalski, Manufacturing Expert in Residence. Welcome to the show. So before we kick things off,
we got a squad here today, Richard, an absolute
we have a squad indeed.
This is the first time we've had 4 people on a podcast like this, so let's see how it goes. Probably be some pure chaos here. No, but we're going to have fun, that's for sure.
It's going to be a lot of fun, so stay with us. And so before we kick things off, I know you've had different timelines with Forge. David, how long have you been there now?
So going on 2 years now.
2 years, and how about you, Mark? You're new to the team.
I am in my 4th week, so I'm drinking from a fire hose, but it doesn't feel like waterboarding anymore, so it's all good.
All good indeed.
That's great. And Dave, tell us a little bit about yourself real quick, a little background and how you ended up at Forge.
Yeah, so I'm originally from upstate New York in Rochester, and started at Forge about 2 years ago, actually as a co-op through Northeastern's internship program, and I've since stayed on with the team. And really my main role at Forge now is I get to meet with all the startups and learn more about the manufacturing processes that they're looking for, and then ultimately connect them with the right manufacturers for them.
Totally. Yeah. And we'll definitely be diving into the details in Forge and in just a little bit. But Mark, how about you?
I am from right here from Massachusetts, which is actually a kind of a rare thing. Most people can come in for school and then they stay. But I've got 40 some years in manufacturing. I actually started on the production floor as an assembler and worked my way up. And when I left the corporate world a few years ago to start a consultancy business, I was Chief Operating Systems Officer for a semiconductor company. I've also got about 20 years in not-for-profit with the Society of Manufacturing Engineers. I was their president, and I'm now currently on their board for their education foundation. And my wife is in supply chain, so we have some very boring operation-centered discussions around the dinner table every night.
I'm sure you've got some great factory floor stories as well from your time.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
One of the early stories I had was when I was working in a PC board factory. I was actually out there helping somebody solder something, and they were like, wow, you're an executive. How do you know how to do that? So it's good to start at the bottom.
Hey, that's great, though. That's a leader leading right there, though, too. Come on. That's what it's all about, rolling up the sleeves and getting your hands dirty. So, of course, curious about Forge. Who is Forge, and does Forge stand for something? And what are you guys all about, and what's the real problem too that Forge is trying to solve?
Right. So Forge is a nonprofit on a mission to help startups navigate the journey from physical prototype to commercialization and impact at scale. So really what that means is Forge tries to act as an ally for these early stage startups that maybe have a prototype but don't know where to take it from there. So our 2 main services that we offer are first and foremost education services to help the startups kind of navigate the journey. We host different workshops, events, really just to offer our startups the right information that they need to then take it to a higher scale. And then ultimately, when they're at that point, we help to connect them with manufacturing services, whether that be design firms or full-scale contract manufacturers locally within the region. So that way they can, drive down to their local manufacturer, be able to refine their design and continue to scale their product and ultimately their business.
And what would you say, though, that is there a kind of a problem or a challenge too that you're seeing with these early stage companies when they're coming to you looking for help?
Yeah, oftentimes you don't know what you don't know. And I'm sure Mark and everyone on the call can really speak to the fact that manufacturers speak their own language, and that can be a really intimidating environment for someone that maybe has a PhD in biomedical engineering and they're incredibly intelligent, but it's just having insight to kind of the infrastructure of the manufacturing world can be a difficult barrier for them to overcome.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, we have some great innovation in Massachusetts, but a lot of times what happens is people default to, oh, I need to reduce my cost really quickly and I need to offshore this to someplace else in the world. And the reality is that we have a really deep manufacturing supply chain here in Massachusetts. And, another tagline that we like to use is, if you can invent it here, you can manufacture it here too. So that's one of the things that Forge is trying to do. The other day I was on the webinar with both with you, Richard, and so was David, and we were talking about. We opened up with an icebreaker about how things were made. We showed like red Solo cups and wheels and stuff like that. And a lot of times, people have seen things, but they really actually don't know how things are made. And so we like to help with that. And a lot of times as well, you'll have multiple ways of doing things. Today, 3D printing is one of those things that people generally, oh, I'm going to 3D print my parts. Well, that may be true. You can 3D print anything you want, but is that the best way to do it? And even within the traditional manufacturing technologies, should I cast something? Should I, bend it? Should I weld it? What are all those options? And, what I try to do being on the supply chain is help people get through those decisions. And like David said, sometimes they're really smart, but they just haven't been exposed to those technologies. And so we help a lot with that.
It's a great icebreaker. And thank you again. And I should give a big shout out to Forge, because from day one, you guys have been helping the Impact Program, guiding our startups and delivering this session on manufacturing, supply chain, logistics. So just a big thank you to you for that.
It's really important to note that we do this all for free. We do not charge either our startups or our suppliers. We're funded by grants and sponsors and the like. So that is really important to know because it gives people who are, for a million other reasons, worried about money, about how they're going to make their next payroll or build their next prototype, not an extra added cost.
Mark, you stole the question for you. Well, that's the answer to the question I want to ask, because it's, working in the manufacturing industry, right? And, being a contract manufacturer, what I always find, sometimes challenging is, how do you differentiate yourself, right, from all the other contract manufacturers? The same thing goes for development firms, right? It's like, what is it that's truly unique? And I mean, that's it right there, huh? It's that nonprofit approach. It's the ability to help these companies come in and further develop their technology without having to invest, massive amounts of upfront, capital to do so. So tell us more too about how that works. I'm curious.
Well, I think one of the great things about Forge is that we can somewhat be considered a broker of knowledge. We are not the people who are going to make your part, or we are not the people who are going to design your board. Because we have a breadth of contacts in the industry, we can help you find the best people for the problem you're trying to solve. And I think that's important. And it's also important that we don't have an agenda. We are not trying to push you into a particular manufacturer or a particular design firm. We're trying to sit down with you, listen to what your problem is, and then make those connections in a way that solves the problem for the startup and provides a good fit for the supplier. We even talk about, what makes you in the contract manufacturing field know how important it is to be a good customer. David does it really good, and we'll let him talk about that. But what makes a good customer for a supplier? And a lot of times startups don't know what that means.
Yeah, just to kind of follow up on that, really, since we're a nonprofit and since we don't charge the startups or the suppliers anything to work with us, it gives us a unique position because we don't necessarily have a vested interest in, like Mark said, sending the connections to any particular supplier or anything like that. So really it allows us to take a more holistic perspective when we're making our connections to make sure it's in the best interest of both the startup and the supplier. Because ultimately at the end of the day, those are the ones that, turn into meaningful relationships and eventually contracts and business relationships later on. So like Mark said, in addition to, the discrete manufacturing capabilities, we're also looking at personality. We're looking at, project scope, all of the little things that add up to a good relationship. We take into account when we're making our connections. So definitely, I think it's both a value for our startups to engage with someone that is a good fit for them, but also for our manufacturers, it gives them referrals that are pre-vetted for their particular business. So as opposed to just a cold outreach from a startup that is probably not a good fit, once Forge makes an introduction, both parties can really hit the ground running and hopefully, form a long-term relationship.
And what does that process look like? So if I'm an early stage company and I want to find out more about this, what would be that first step?
Yeah, so the first step actually would be to schedule a call with the Forge team. If you're based in Massachusetts, that would be me at the moment. So you could reach out to me at david@forgeimpact.org or on our website at forgeimpact.org. There's a little tab that says for startups, and you can also schedule a call via the website as well.
And you mentioned, just now in Massachusetts, I know there's expansion plans on the horizon. Can you talk a little bit about that too?
Yeah, so actually just a few weeks ago, we expanded our presence into Connecticut. So really what that means is we now have boots on the ground in Connecticut. But I do want to reiterate that we can serve startups really from all over the world in engaging with manufacturers. So while we are expanding into Connecticut, we're simply building upon the connections that we've had with startups outside of Massachusetts and are looking forward to really kind of hitting the ground running there.
So what I'm hearing here is like Forge, you don't have a building where you've got all this machining and equipment and you're assembling stuff and putting it together. You're talking with the founder of a company. You're learning about what they're trying to do, what they're trying to make, and then you align them with the manufacturer that makes the most sense, or at least you recommend that kind of pathway forward for them.
Exactly.
Two situations that David and I have worked on recently. One was a company that's doing battery reclamation from cars, and they're going to turn those into little power stations, and they need a grid attached inverter to make that all happen. So my counterpart, Scott Longley, actually helped us find a company locally here in Massachusetts that does that kind of thing. And then just the other day, David said, hey, we have a contact from a alpaca farmer who wants to make socks, and they're making socks in Michigan. Can you help me find somebody who does carding and knitting and spinning here in Massachusetts? So I spent an hour the other day going through Google looking for people who do that sort of service here in Massachusetts. So it can be pretty wide ranging. And I think one of the things that Forge brings is that because of the diversity of our team, we've all been in some manner of making these connections. So we kind of know how to look. After 40 years of building product myself, I've been there, or in that role that the person who is in the startup is facing now. I've done 6 startups myself, so I know how to go find those things. I may not necessarily come and remove metal from parts to make your parts, but I know how to go find that. So we also pre-vet the suppliers as well, not only the startups. We go, I think this is going to be a good fit, or it won't be a good fit.
Do you have a core group of suppliers and partners though that you typically go to, or is it just pretty much different, unique every time?
The needs of the startup for that particular project really are paramount when we're making our connections. So if there's a unique capability, like Mark mentioned about sourcing a unique inverter, that definitely drives the connections that we make. But we do have like a list of trusted suppliers that we work with, but at the same time, every project is different. So we want to make sure that we're connecting the startup with someone that is local to them, someone that fits their unique capabilities. So it's both a mix of kind of our go-to suppliers, and then also our suppliers that are perfect fits for a particular project.
Such a great service.
It really is. And Richard, I know I'm firing away here, but another thing too is, Richard, it's like we don't typically, talk to companies that are nonprofits, and what I'm really interested about too is how do you go about, raising capital then and money and getting, people to invest in Forge, and kind of what's the benefit to them? And if there is one, and how does that really work? How do you what's their expectations, with the business? Can you shed light on that?
Yeah, so like Mark mentioned, the majority of our funding comes from philanthropic grants as well as through the state. But we also have some sponsors that are actually manufacturers who choose to sponsor us really to promote what we're doing, but also to get greater access to our startups through events and our newsletter and things like that. As far as the things that they're looking for, our funders in general, it's really, making sure that there are good outcomes both for the startup and the supplier. So to date, we've generated over $34 million in local contracts. So, you can imagine for the state funders, that can be quite a compelling statistic as a way to kind of show the economic development. But really kind of the best way to support Forge, whether it be for our startups or our sponsors, is really just to keep us in the loop and give us, feedback on our connections. Because ultimately, if one, develops into a $10 million contract, we can then really celebrate that connection and be able to kind of show our value to our funders. So really the main metrics that we use are definitely the contracts. But then also we look at how a startup has accelerated their build stage, which essentially if they have one prototype and they're up to a beta prototype, or maybe they have beta prototype and they take it up to low volume production. We also look at that too as a metric to see, how impactful our services have been in terms of putting them on the right roadmap for their product development.
Yeah, well, it's really important to note too that while we do have manufacturers who sponsor us, it is not a pay-for-play situation. The sponsorship is really about them getting more access to events and getting more visibility in our newsletter and all that, but we don't all of a sudden start steering more business to a sponsor.
Yeah.
And since David was talking about the numbers, let me talk about a couple of other numbers here. And the number is a moving target. The one I have written down here on a piece of paper, which I'm sure is wrong, is over 600 startups that we've connected with and 450 suppliers. So it is a pretty large number and growing every day. And one of the interesting things is 87% of our startups have survived. And so while we cannot take credit for that survival rate, we're some small part of that, and we can be pretty proud of that.
It's a testament to you guys pointing these companies obviously in the right direction and aligning them with the right partners. So
yeah, absolutely, Kyle. And I think as well, like you guys are not only connecting and educating, but you also have some amazing resources on your website. I wonder, David, if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So last year we had the opportunity to run a manufacturing readiness workshop series, which essentially, helped our startups again kind of navigate that journey from prototype to production. But as a result of those workshops, we actually created some workbooks that we use to share with our startups. So it's it's almost like we call it little Forge homework, and it really kind of is that in a way. But it helps our startups kind of think through their manufacturing problems and then ultimately come up with some solutions and come up with a clearer roadmap for their development.
It's such a great asset. And I love the way it's really methodical in terms of just a step-by-step process. And something, Mark, you mentioned earlier, just making people think about, well, what is that process I need to tap into to make my product?
Yeah, my wife works for Desktop Metal, which is sort of a startup in a way up in Burlington, and she's in supply chain. She was looking over my shoulder while I was looking at the Forge, how to evaluate the 3 suppliers you're nailing things down. She said, oh, can I have a printout of that? I'm going to take that to work and use it. So it's not just for startups.
Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing. I mean, obviously you are focused on the startup market, but, do you get approached by bigger companies who think, they would like to tap into Forge's services?
Yeah, so we work with startups from the prototype level all the way through to full scale production. So we do have some companies that come to us that are at a much larger scale. They might already have a manufacturing plant, and they approach us to connect with some of our services. So there's no restrictions as far as you have to be at a prototype level. That's really kind of the entry point, and then from there that continues all the way through to full scale production. So yeah, that's definitely a good thing to highlight as well.
Yeah, and there's an example of just this week I was on the phone with a company that is making recycled plastic roundabouts, rotaries, and they are currently in production. They've been building product for a while, but they're primarily building it out in Minnesota, and they are actually a legal entity here in Massachusetts, and they want to bring it back to Massachusetts. So I had a phone call with them, trying to get David to help them get into our network, and we'll follow up and see if we can find manufacturers for them here in Massachusetts.
Very cool. And Kyle, I know as much as you and I are focused on the medtech space, you guys are obviously doing much more than that. You're looking into several verticals. So what else do you get involved with?
We're all over the map when it comes to technology. I mean, I mentioned alpaca socks, which is kind of a fun thing, but we're doing aerospace, transportation, because we are a spinoff, I guess you'd call it, from Greentown Labs. There's a fair amount of clean tech in our portfolio. We get a lot of referrals from them, but robotics is kind of an interesting thing. One of our startups that I think is really interesting is, if you're deaf-blind, obviously you can't. If you're deaf, you can't see to read lips, and you can't see American Sign Language. We have a company that's actually making a robotic device that a deaf-blind person can touch and feel to use to interpret American Sign Language. So there's all kinds of great problem solving there. And obviously we do some medical devices, more than a few medical devices.
Brilliant. Well, yeah, again, we're delighted to have you as a resource, because I can tell you the feedback we get from our companies is so positive that they have access to your expertise and your network, because it's really impactful. And I think really that's what Forge stands for, is the impact it creates in the marketplace.
And so, what about the regulatory side? You talk a lot about the manufacturing and supply chain, but what about, the quality management system, regulatory path? What's the involvement look like there, especially in medical device?
Yeah, great question. So in addition to, the discrete sort of manufacturing capabilities like CNC machining or injection molding, we also have folks in our network that can help with regulatory testing, so FDA approvals, things like that, as well as other services that support a broader kind of manufacturing process. So we have folks that help set up factories, as well as we even have like some law firms. So our services extend outside of discrete manufacturing to some of these more supplemental things that might come to mind.
I mean, another thing that somebody said to me once, that the human beings in your factory are part of your supply chain, so you need to make sure that you have a robust supply chain of human beings. We can also put people in touch with education resources. People are doing, Massachusetts, for instance, is doing a program right now where if you bring on an apprentice and you want to send them to any outside training, they'll give you grants up to $4,800 per person. So we can put you in touch with, for instance, the New England Advanced Manufacturing Partnership, to get your staff trained, as well as get the widgets into your factory.
And Kyle, again, you'll fully understand that through Global Women's Connect, you guys being a manufacturing supplying company yourself, but everyone's obviously lived through the pandemic recently, and that's brought about a whole set of unique challenges. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit now about some of those challenges and how they've sort of impacted the supply chain and the companies you support.
Yeah, so I'm sure the COVID pandemic has really affected everyone in their own unique way, but as far as Forge goes, it was kind of our first iteration of being able to support startups from outside of the Massachusetts, Boston area into serving more broader startups. And as you know, we all know there's massive amounts of supply chain related disruptions, which help to influence a lot more onshoring of production. So startups were able to leverage our network to really be able to, meet with a startup that's down the road as opposed to around the world. So that way they can avoid some of those disruptions and, ultimately help to continue to, stay in business and everything like that, because it was definitely a scary time.
Well, what's really interesting too, and sorry, Mark, I'm sure you would
No,
love
it's
to
okay.
elaborate, but just on the point of that topic is that, you saw a lot of companies, looking to, bring manufacturing maybe back into the United States and maybe more local into Massachusetts. Did you see that as an opportunity? And also, did that also kind of pose any new challenges for those companies?
I think one of the challenges that you see a lot of times is the math. A lot of times, I worked in manufacturing for years, and you'd have a part that was being made offshore somewhere for $1, right? And you'd say, hey, I want to bring it back to Massachusetts here to have it built, and the new cost is $1.25. And the people in the finance group look at you like, we can't spend more money for the part. And then you have to educate them about the real cost of that part that we're getting from some far off place means I have thousands and thousands of dollars of them on a boat somewhere. So we're tying up your capital, right? Every time my team needs to make an engineering change order, we have to wait 6 months for it to cut in, right? Every time I want to go pull the soldering iron in a plant as I want to do, I have to spend, $5,000 in travel. And so when you add all of that up, it actually is cheaper sometimes to build stuff here in Massachusetts than it is to build it overseas. And so that's one of the things we have to help startups get their head around is what's the true cost of ownership of manufacturing, right? And in particular, the people who are pulling the purse strings for whatever startup, they need to understand how to do true cost modeling for manufacturing. I think they'll find that in more cases than not, building it local is cheaper or at least competitive with building it in some far off land.
What about the capability side though to this? So obviously, there's the cost impacts, but do you find there being challenges where, there might not be, as robust of a manufacturing capability maybe here locally as there was, maybe in another part of the world? Do you run into that? And if you do, how do you kind of work around that?
Well, I think if you certain things, America in general has decided, well, we don't really do that anymore. We're letting other countries do that. I think if you're a startup and you have an element of your manufacturing that is more towards the bleeding edge, you're using highly engineered materials or processes that are very, very technical. If you talk about, we have companies like Boston Centerless here and in Woburn that does, very, very high-end materials, doing centerless grinding and that kind of thing. You're going to be hard pressed, honestly, to find in some of the far off countries the technical knowledge and the materials availability that you can find right here in the United States, and in particular Massachusetts. Massachusetts actually has a pretty deep technological and manufacturing capability that I think people just don't think about because they're just not exposed to it. And we hope at Forge to expose people more to that.
That's neat. So more sophistication, it's almost
Right.
like the more sophisticated, the better to bring back over, into Massachusetts.
Yeah, right. And within the context of medical devices too, simply having more awareness of the different certifications needed, the FDA process, all of that kind of goes into really the whole kind of profile of the capability of a particular supplier. So, there might be another person around the world that can do injection molding, but there's someone based in Massachusetts that has that added level of U.S. based FDA regulatory kind of perspective too. So that can be another benefit that startups can have.
Yeah, for a period of my career, I worked for Zoll Medical, which does pacemakers and defibrillators, and I learned a lot about traceability in medical devices. And so, I literally had a guy walk in from the FDA once and pick up a PC board, point to a particular resistor on the board and say, I need you to show me the traceability records all the way back to where this came from and the lot number for it. And while sometimes you think you can get that capability from out of the country, you can't audit it really easily. And what you don't want to find out is when the FDA guy is standing in your plant, looking at your records, that everything that they told you was not true. So here in the United States, we tend to do a better job of that, tend to have a better understanding. And if you want to drive down the road and check on them,
you can do
every
that.
once in a while. It's not a $5,000 trip.
Yeah.
I was going to say, that's a great point.
Yeah.
And you made this last week. I was going to say in the session, you spoke to the startups. If you're thinking about low volume prototyping, control is a big aspect. And if you want to pop in and just have that conversation about the design, maybe making a small change, that's a lot easier to do if they're on your doorstep rather than traveling around the world.
Yeah. And I like how you touched on the sophistication of materials, right? I mean, Richard, look at UMass Lowell. Right? What were you saying yesterday? They're top ranked university in what, plastics engineering?
Definitely. I mean, I think
right. So
we're so fortunate to have
right here in our backyard.
Yeah, and companies again, like you mentioned, Zoll Medical is just on our doorstep, literally a stone's throw away. And I think it's really what Forge does best, is shining a light on these companies, making sure people are aware of the capabilities we have on our doorstep. So what about some future gazing? We're going to look ahead into the future, and what's kind of most exciting for you in terms of opportunities for manufacturing and potentially support for startups?
I think that what's really exciting is the overall attitude in the United States, which is we're getting reminded that manufacturing is an important core part of this country. The government's starting to come around. I think there were a lot of bad things that came out of the pandemic. One of the things that was great about the pandemic was we realized how kind of messed up our supply chain is and how many things we actually don't make here in the United States. In particular, we learned a lot about medical devices, and oh my God, we don't know how to make aspirin here, and we don't know how to make masks here, and intubation equipment and all that. And I think that has re-energized the idea of innovation, and in particular manufacturing here in the United States. So that's a positive thing. I think that state governments and organizations like Forge now are focusing on helping companies in general and medical companies in particular. So I think we're in a good time. There are going to be some financial challenges out there in the world, with the VCs, with Silicon Bank and all of that. So it's going to be interesting to see how that all shakes out. But I do think that there are other ways that we will continue to find a way to flow money into this. Certainly 3D technology, virtual technology, that sort of thing. I mentioned that I work with SME, for instance. It's another part of my job. We're doing virtual training, and you're starting to see that bleed into medical device manufacturing, where you can do virtual training, where you don't actually need to cut up a cadaver or do a pig trial or that kind of thing, because you can build virtual models. So I think it's a pretty exciting time. Even the way we collect data now is very different with AWS and business intelligence gives us a better idea on collecting data for clinical trials. So it's a pretty exciting time. As I'm ending my career, I'm glad to be with Forge because now I'm getting to work with the bleeding edge in a way that I didn't think I'd be able to do when I was in my 60s. So, by the way, I think it's a good thing for people who are looking to find another way to retool their career. If you've been in manufacturing for a lot of years, join an organization like Forge or get involved with M2D2 or something like that, and use that experience to help out the newer, younger companies.
Retool your career. I mean, come on, is that not do you have to trademark that one? I mean, you might have to. And Dave, what about you? You know, you've been with Forge obviously for a couple of years. It sounds like, you know, you were right out of your co-op there. So, you know, I guess what's your, you know, hope for the future of Forge, and, you know, where do you think you guys are going to go, and what kind of maybe capabilities too that you might be looking to add? Where are you looking to evolve and continue to grow your company?
Yeah, I think the big thing is really just kind of multiply the impact that we have been able to provide to date to more and more companies. Being on the front line of meeting with these startups, it's exciting how diverse the founders are. You might have a spin out from MIT, but you might also have someone who's just moonlighting and making this like little device in their garage. And we definitely see all sorts of different people come through us and making things. And I think that's a really exciting thing, both for Forge, but just for the community in general. People are expressing themselves creatively and, you know, helping to develop new products. So in the future, I look forward to continuing to support those people in, you know, developing their products, developing their ideas, and ultimately hoping to develop some of the next companies that get to kind of blossom in the region.
And any final advice for startups? You know, I know we've covered a lot today, but kind of, again, thinking about how they would get in touch with you, and just, of course, you know, what's that thing they should be looking out for?
As far as advice for startups, I think it's always just keep on learning. There's just so much to learn, and there's so many pitfalls that you can avoid if you learn from someone else. So definitely, you know, keep an open eye out for that. And as far as engaging with Forge, the best way would be to check out our website at forgeimpact.org, or you can reach out to myself at david@forgeimpact.org or mark@forgeimpact.org.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
Wow.
I'll just reinforce what David said. You know, for startups, knowing what you don't know is important, and don't be embarrassed by asking questions. You know, we're all, you know, being a lifelong learner is a good thing, and in particular for startups. And there are lots of people out there who want to give back at this point. So if you're just starting up technology or your career, reach out. There's lots of help out there if you want to ask for it.
Great message. And just a huge thank you again to you both and to the whole Forge team for everything you do.
Well, thank you for having us on today.
Well, guys, that's it for today's MedTech Impact podcast. I'm Kyle Cruz.
And I'm Richard Michalski.
And that was Dave and Mark from Forge Impact. Thanks again, guys.
Keep innovating.